Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Paul Betancourt, sitting in for Gary Pollitt.
And from the left, I'm David Jones. This week on Red, White, and Blue, a discussion about Texas 2012. Is it the best of times or worst of times? Is the conservative era in Texas over, Paul? No. We've got a number of issues that Cal Jillson's going to be talking about.
Well, joining us tonight, as David has already mentioned, is Cal Jillson, professor of political science at SMU and author of his new book, Lone Star Tarnished. And Chuck DeVore, former California State Assemblyman, now a senior fellow at the Fiscal Policy for Texas Public Policy Foundation, one of the nation's premier market think tanks. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good to be with you.
We got a fellow from Dallas. We got a guy from San Antonio. I mean, we're covering some bases here. Cal Jillson, I take the position that everybody in the Republican primary that we just saw for president read about Rick Perry and the Texas myth in your book and rejected it. Is there any evidence to back that up?
Well, not very much directly, but Governor Perry didn't do very well in the presidential primary. But there's a better test. Kansas is debating in its legislature whether to get rid of the income tax to be more like Texas. And some academics up in Kansas got that book and explained to the state why they might not want to do that, because Texas lags in a number of important dimensions like income, education, access to health care. So I do think we've got some problems in Texas that we're not addressing.
So I just want to hear you say more, though, about what you think Rick Perry was peddling in this primary that you heard that you think fits into your book and its overall framework.
Yeah, there is a Texas model that is well known in the state that Rick Perry tried to take nationally, and that is a model that calls for small government, low taxes, deregulation, a heavy dose of personal responsibility, that people's position in life is generally an earned position. He took that into the national contest, and even on the Republican side, there weren't very many takers. There was a very famous discussion in the Dallas Morning News with H.R. Brands of University of Texas, very famous historian, who said that most of the other states in the country look at Texas and not very many of them decide they want to be like that, because although we do some things very well, like job creation, lots of things we don't do very well at all, and our demographics are changing in such a way as to aggravate the problems that we have.
Well, Cal, I think there's another side to this equation. Chuck, I think you would probably disagree with some of that analysis, and clearly Governor Perry was talking about the fact that Texas has been a magnet for job creation. So why don't you give us the conservative response?
Well, absolutely. It's interesting that the professor mentions Kansas, because in next door Oklahoma, of course, they're talking about completely eliminating the income tax to be more competitive with Texas. I read the professor's book and found, as a former California lawmaker for 6 years, I was vice chairman of the Revenue and Taxation Committee, and like a net of over 2 million Californians in the last 12 years, I moved out of California, and the number one state of destination for former Californians is Texas. And there's a reason for that, and the reason is that in the last 12 years, Texas has seen a net increase of about 1.2 million jobs, and California has seen a net decrease of about 300,000 jobs. But there's something more important when you begin to compare the two biggest states in the country. And the professor does a great job, I think, especially of Texas's history and its proud history. But I noted that he mentioned California over 110 times in the book. And I'm a little bit of an expert on California. And there's one very important thing that he overlooked from an economic standpoint, and that's the cost of living. And when you start comparing states and the average income, the income per capita in states, it doesn't mean a lot unless you can actually put a roof over your head and buy food and clothing and transportation for your family. And the fact is that Texas has the second lowest cost of living in the nation after Oklahoma, 90% of the U.S. average. California has the third highest cost of living in the country after Hawaii and New York. There's a 42% difference between the states. That means you got to earn $14.20 in California for every $10 you earn in Texas.
Let's not forget
the same standard of living.
Let's not forget the Cleveland Fed and their analysis of state rankings.
Cal, go ahead and respond, please.
Texas does have a low cost of living, but in terms of per capita personal income, in terms of the earning power of Texans, it has barely changed since 1950. In 1950, Texans earned 94% of the U.S. average for per capita income. Today, they earn 97%. So essentially flat compared to the nation. If there is a Texas miracle, why hasn't it showed up in better earnings for individual Texans and their families?
Well, Cal, when I read through the book, and again, there's a tremendous amount of data in here. You should be, congratulated for trying to pull it all together. I just disagree with some of the conclusions. One of the conclusions I disagree with, and I think Chuck talked about, is you've got an unemployment picture in Texas that's far superior to the national average. Over the last 5 decades, there's only one decade that we were slightly below the U.S. average in employment gain. And it clearly is not Texas Lone Star still rising because of the job growth that we had. Wasn't Governor Perry right about this one point?
Well, job growth has been impressive, but the value of those jobs, the income paid by those jobs, is often quite low, and they often lack benefits. So job creation is a positive, but the quality of those jobs is in many cases suspect, and they tend not to have benefits attached. That's why we have 25% of Texans that don't have access to health insurance. The national average is 15%.
And Texas Public Policy Foundation would say?
Well, let's again go back to the comparisons that the professor, I think, rightly put in his book, because the biggest state and the second biggest state are very similar in many ways. They both have youthful populations. They both have large numbers of minorities and foreign-born population. But again, back on this cost of living issue, which is a big deal, the Texas minimum wage, as an example, is at the federal minimum wage. California has its own minimum wage that's higher. And a lot of people would point at that and say, look, the poor, the working poor, are better off in California. Not so, because even at minimum wage, the Texas minimum wage actually buys you significantly more goods and services than the much higher California minimum wage. And here's the kicker, the U.S. Department or Bureau of Census, U.S. Census Bureau, does an annual ranking where they look at poverty measures, the poverty level.
Sure.
Most Americans don't know that the poverty level is fixed the same in every state for, like a family of 4, it's the same income level, unadjusted for cost of living. It's just been recently, in the last few months, that the Census Bureau was pressured by Congress into having an experimental poverty level where they actually take cost of living into account. And when you do that, California's California's poverty level soars, Texas's goes down, and actually the California poverty level is significantly higher than Texas's.
Cal, on page 40.
California is not the appropriate comparison.
Well, let's talk about the wealthy states.
You mentioned it 110 plus times.
I often compare California and Florida just so you have similar-sized states. There are other states in the country that are appropriate comparisons, but I think the key thing that we need to focus on is that Texas Anglos are doing quite well and are very comfortable. If you compare personal income of Anglo-Texans with personal income of Anglos in the other 49 states, Texas Anglos rank 13th. If you compare Texas Hispanics to Hispanics in the other 49 states, they rank 43rd. And the issue going forward is that the Anglo population of Texas has gone from 70% in 1970 to 48 today to 33 by 2040, according to the Texas State Data Center. The Hispanic population has gone from 20% to 38% today to 55% in 2040. Right. And if income and education don't change and Hispanics do better in educational attainment and income, Texas must necessarily be a poorer state.
You do have an interesting table in the book where you take the current per capita income of the racial groups and then project out with, if you have a demographic change, that it takes it, I believe, the average from 20,000 down to 15,000 on a per capita basis. However, I think the fundamental driver that you come across in the book, and I agree with when I was tax assessor, was Hispanic kids are simply not getting out of high school and going on to a college degree at the rate that we need them to. Right. In fact, one of the great stats in here, besides the typo I told you about, but hey, 1 out of a million is not bad, is that the average Hispanic score in 1992 was 902 on their SAT combined, and guess what? In 2011, it's 902. So clearly, we're not making an impact in society on that score.
Yeah.
Now, so what's the problem? What do you think's happening? And Chuck, I'll come back and ask you what the solution is.
Yeah, I think that the problem is spending on education. you often hear that we can't just throw money at Texas education. We've got to engage in reform. But we've been engaged in reform since Gilmer-Akins in 1949, the Perot reforms. George W. Bush ran for governor of Texas and president of the United States on his education reform credentials. But in the last year that we have complete data for, Texas ranked 45th among the 50 states. And then we cut $4 billion out of our public schools in the 2010 legislative session, 11 legislative session, and we're moving toward more cuts in 2013. Those numbers are not going to change, particularly for Hispanics, unless we take more seriously the need to improve Hispanic educational attainment. 40% of Hispanics in Texas don't have a high school degree, let alone go to college. And if we just sit around and don't address that and they become a much larger proportion of the population, Texas economically cannot thrive.
And they've probably been sitting around in California for a good while as that state moves in the same direction that Texas has. I don't know whether or not your Republican leadership that you were a part of in California recognize that either.
You mean Jerry Brown, David?
No. Chuck was a member of the Republican
the allegedly Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. Right. I was going to say.
Your people did make a deal with Democrats to raise taxes, something that you famously opposed and resigned rather than see happen.
Absolutely, I oppose it. Let's get into some of the data first of all. The SAT scores are interesting, but there's also another benchmark that's done nationally with 4th and 8th graders in math, science, and reading. What's interesting about that is it's a larger audience. SAT is kind of self-selecting the people who may be going to college. And of course, in this case, it's largely influenced by the number of foreign-born population you have, which has changed quite a bit over the last 30 years. So if you look at the 8 biggest states in the country, and then you actually look at these national standardized test scores for all kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, and black kids, what you see is that in 24 of these categories, Texas is number 1 in 11 of the 24 categories under national standardized testing regime. California is last in 15 of the 24.
What are you grinning at, Cal?
And the fact is,
I'm asking him a question because he's grinning. You know, I don't have anybody laughing that often.
Yeah, it's hard to those scores. I know about. They bounce around a good bit. I would be surprised to hear that Texas was top in 11th out of 24 or whatever the number is, because on a whole series of measures, Texas comes in much nearer the bottom, and Texas usually avoids national comparisons. We refuse to join in the national education standards that were developed by 45 states over the last couple of years because we are loath to be compared systematically with other states nationally because we tend to fare so badly.
Here's why, is because when you compare, for example, Texas or California to Wisconsin or even Massachusetts, there's gigantic demographic differences between the states. And when you have a state that's more homogeneous and has uniformly a higher education level and is as large as perhaps a small corner of Texas, that's very different than when you're comparing it to a state that's very diverse demographically. And so that's why it's important to actually break down the numbers and look at all students and then the students by race and ethnicity. The data I got was right from the Federal Department of Education. I didn't make it up. And I looked at it just recently for our own book that we're working on called The Texas Model with Brooke Rollins, the president and CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And the fact is that Texas was first in 11 of 24 categories. And what's interesting is if you look at the achievement gap between white kids and African American kids and white kids and Hispanic kids, Texas tied with Florida for the smallest achievement gap. And the only areas where Florida beat Texas was with Hispanic kids. And why is that? Because 36% of their Hispanics are from Cuba.
Chuck is making a very important point, and that is that Texas is far more diverse than other states, and states that are more homogeneous have an easier educational task, which says to me that when you've got a more difficult educational task than many other states do, you address it head on as hard as you can. We are 45th in the nation in per capita student expenditures. That will not do it. If our situation is more difficult, we got to go at it.
But Cal, the comparison to Florida is important because Florida is a very large state that doesn't have a personal income tax.
Right.
So they've got relatively the same sources of funding that we do. So what's wrong with the comparison to Florida and if we're doing better on that gap, as Chuck had mentioned?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with the comparison of Florida. I do think these comparisons with other major Sun Belt states are very informative. And Florida, under Jeb Bush, engaged in some educational reforms that have had a good effect. But we're talking about Texas, and we're talking about underfunding the schools with increasing minority populations that must succeed if Texas is to succeed.
And Chuck, let me ask you this. What Cal addresses in his book in a more broader context is that Texas is really a state based on cronyism, one-party state governance, on low-income people paying the most of the taxes and protecting the interests of certainly of oil and gas and of the wealthy. That is what the Texas model is. Do you disagree with that model?
100%. I mean, first of all, when you say low-income people paying the taxes,
that's called sales tax.
It's actually, the preponderance of money raised is from your property tax.
Taxes.
Because you got to look at state and local. You have to look at the preponderance. But let's get back to one of the professor's assertions that I think goes to the heart of what I think is an economic error in his book. He talked about Texas being 45th per capita in expenditures for education. Well, excuse me, Texas is 49th in the country for cost of living. And again, he said per capita. You have to look at what those dollars buy you. He has a great chart here showing that Texas teachers right about now are paid 88% of the national average of pay.
Median, right.
But that's okay because Texas, it costs 90% of the national average to live. You factor that in, it means they're at 98% of the national average in real income, which sounds pretty close to
be
average.
able to buy a TV if you can't read?
No, David.
That's a
Professor
non sequitur,
Gilson, it's a good point. What's your response to that?
It is a good point. We do have a lower cost of living than the national average. It's about 90%. But as far as educational expenditures and teacher salaries, the future of the state depends on the achievement of Texas students. And something like half of Texas teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. Tremendous turnover because of the pressures that they're under in the classroom. So I want to talk just about taxes. I wouldn't call Texas crony capitalism so much as I would a regressive tax system, and it changed dramatically in the 1980s. We've always depended heavily on the sales tax, and in the early 1980s, it was 60% of state-generated revenues. When the price of oil collapsed in '86 and the property and banking collapses followed that, we shifted 15% of the tax burden onto the backs of consumers and away from oil and natural gas. Severance tax receipts went from 20% down to about 5%. They're ticking up now, but we still have tax breaks for oil and natural gas in place over the course of the last 20 years, and they're now permanent. While those industries are absolutely thriving, we could move some of the tax burden back to oil and natural gas very easily, where it has historically been in Texas, without affecting the performance of those industries.
So, Professor Gilson, so you would see that as a solution as opposed to trying to create an income tax, which you spent a lot of time on in here.
Yeah, what I try to do in the last chapter of the book is to lay out various scenarios for additional revenues, from increasing the sales tax by 0.5%, which would put us at the highest in the country, very near California, reducing some of the exemptions from the sales tax. There's a woman named Lori Taylor at Texas A&M who is, I think, one of the state's experts on this, that described that as a way to get $5 billion annually. I think we ought to redo the margins tax so that it generates the income that was expected of it when it was passed several years ago.
Cal,
but the big money's in the income tax if you're
Cal,
if
you're
you
not
need it.
paying that tax, because I am, and I tell you that's one of the most horrifically poorly designed taxes
Then
in the
redesign
country.
it.
Right.
Then redesign
And
it.
it's not going to happen, Paul. We're not going to have tax reform as long as, and Chuck and Cal, please address this, as long as, and I insist on this and rebut it if you can, that the government of Texas is organized to protect people who pay through lobbyists, legislature, to do whatever they want. As an example, the credit card debt that all Texas cities, families in Texas have, and is higher than the national average. Payday lenders, unregulated in Texas, charge 600% if they want to on loans. And guess what? That keeps people completely dispossessed and disenfranchised.
David, your original
That's the
point.
government. That's crony capitalism. It's the best example I have of it. And of course, Cash America's vice president is head of Perry's Texas Finance
He's filibustering. You can cut it
No, I
any
mean,
time.
that's crony, that's crony capitalism.
Here's the bottom line. People in America are still free to vote with their feet.
Sure.
And that's the ultimate, I think, the ultimate indicator of the relative strength of states. And when you have the biggest state in the country hemorrhaging over 2 million people over the last 12 years, most of whom live in Texas, most of whom have moved to Texas, that's a voluntary move. Nobody's put a gun to their head and said, you have to move out of Southern California, you have to move out of the Bay Area, and you have to go to Austin. That's happening voluntarily because of what? Because of job growth here, because people want to move to Texas to provide for their families. Now, some people would say that Texas perhaps has too much of a free market. I think that's the argument that we heard here. But I just came from a state that's a nanny state that tries to proscribe and tell you what to do with every small thing in your life, and it's not working. It's collapsing.
David, I would not move to Jerry Brown in California at this point, Professor.
One of the arguments that Jair made all the time and that we just heard was true in the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s, that there was a substantial move of talent, educated corporate CEOs, some corporate relocations. But I opened the book to a demographic page here from the Texas State Data Center, which suggests that between 2010 and 2040, there will be net zero Anglo population growth in Texas. That means the number of Anglos in Texas today is the same as the number of Anglos that will be in Texas in 2040, but there will be 9 million more Hispanic citizens.
Right.
9 million. And unless we run our educational system in a way that brings those Hispanic kids to the current level of Anglo education, at least, if not better, they will be unable to carry this economy forward.
I don't dispute the basic notion that the future of the state's tied up with its young people.
Sure.
But the projections that the professor's relying on, I believe, are 4 years old. And a lot of things have happened just in the last year where the slowdown in America has caused demographers to completely overturn their projections of the growth of Hispanics in America, so that now it's very modest. Because, in fact, what's happening is reverse migration. People who are here legally and illegally are going back home to Mexico and Salvador and Guatemala, and those economic or demographic projections are now completely different.
Well, and also, too, there's macroeconomic changes like Eagle Ford, the shale plays, which are billions of dollars of investment in southern Texas that didn't exist before.
So let's talk about politics, Paul.
Okay.
Politics.
Well, hold
Because
on.
politics is part of the interest that conservatives have in holding on to power. And throughout the history of Texas, those politics have created a legal infrastructure that has oppressed people, kept them from voting if possible.
Oh, David.
Only primaries. To poll taxes. To today, Voting Rights Act is being opposed by conservatives.
Historically, it was very clear that the founding generations in Texas intended to build an Anglo republic, pushed out the Indians, blacks were slaves, pushed the Hispanics below the Rio Grande where possible. That's no longer the issue directly. The issue directly today is that Texas has a bifurcated economy and set of opportunities in which Texas Anglos, who are a smaller, a reducing component of the population, do very well and are very pleased with Texas. But Hispanics and blacks don't do nearly as well, are much less pleased, and are growing as a
Gentlemen, I just
population.
will make a comment. My predecessor took poll taxes in office in 1964. That's almost 50 years ago. Let's go to the present.
Well,
and the question is, I'm going to quote Dickens, Texas, the best of times or the worst of times. Chuck.
Oh, it's the best of times, and I think it's going to get better. I think Texas is a model for a once-and-future America. And, just very quickly to the point about Hispanic business ownership. I looked at the U.S. Small Business Administration. Did you know that Hispanics own businesses in far larger numbers in Texas than they do in California?
Yes, many of them are my customers. Cal.
Yeah, I think that these are good times in Texas if you're Anglo well-educated and relatively well-off. But Texas is not facing very serious problems that will limit its future prosperity.
Well, and let's close with this. What will happen in 2012 in terms of the Hispanic vote in the United States? What's your political opinion about how large it will be and where it will fall in the presidential race?
Well,
Chuck?
I think some of that vote is going to shift away from the president because certainly a lot of promises that were made were not kept. I think that if you want to think of Hispanics as a bloc, which I think is an error, but if you want to think of them as a bloc, I think they're perfectly capable of voting their enlightened self-interest like anyone else.
Yeah,
and I think they're more interested in jobs and opportunity.
That's right, but that enlightened self-interest makes Hispanic vote 2-to-1 Democrat. Cubans in Florida don't. They lean Republican. But Mexican-American Hispanics vote 2-to-1 Democrat, except in unusual elections.
Cal, we're going to have to
Bush
stop
reelection.
you. But Chuck, when you write your book, we want you to come back.
A great discussion,
The
guys.
professor will do a rerun.
Thank you all for coming.
Okay.
Thank you.
And we invite you to visit our home online at houstonpbs.org. Click on the local program bar, red, white, and blue. Read about the shows, watch a follow-up discussion, and until next time, get informed and get active.